In the early 20th century, the Indian subcontinent was a hotbed of political and social change, with growing demands for self-governance and representation. This was the backdrop upon which the Minto-morley reforms of 1909 were introduced, a pivotal moment in the history of British India. Named after Lord Minto, the Viceroy of India, and John Morley, the Secretary of State for India, these reforms marked a significant step towards involving Indians in the governance of their own country. The story of the Minto-morley reforms begins in the wake of increasing unrest and the rise of nationalist movements within India. There was a burgeoning sense of discontent among Indians regarding British colonial rule, primarily because of their limited participation in governance. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, was already a decade into advocating for more Indian representation in legislative councils. Morley, who believed in a policy of cautious reform, was appointed as Secretary of State for India in 1905. He understood that to maintain British control, some concessions had to be granted to the Indian people. In collaboration with Lord Minto, Morley drafted the reforms that sought to expand the Indian participation in governance. The Indian Councils Act 1909, which resulted from these reforms, introduced several changes. Perhaps the most notable among them was the expansion of the legislative councils both at the central and provincial levels. The number of Indian members in these councils was increased, giving Indians a greater voice, although still limited. Another significant provision of the Minto-morley reforms was the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims. This was designed to provide Muslims with representation proportional to their numbers, an attempt to address the fears within the Muslim community about being overpowered by the Hindu majority in legislative matters. Despite these changes, the Minto-morley reforms were a double-edged sword. While they did increase Indian participation and address some communal concerns, they also entrenched divisions. The separate electorates sowed seeds of partition that would later become glaring in the subcontinent's history. Thus, the Minto-morley reforms of 1909 were a crucial development that showcased the complexities of colonial governance and the ongoing struggle for Indian self-rule, a journey that would eventually lead to India's independence in 1947.